Tonight we begin with a direct ultimatum that Pentagon officials had feared, NATO commanders had anticipated, and intelligence analysts had prepared for. A warning that unfolded not over weeks of diplomatic negotiation, but in a matter of hours. Hours that shook the foundations of European security. Hours that forced Washington into emergency protocols. Hours that could reshape the entire trajectory of this conflict. What Vladimir Putin did today crossed a line that the Biden administration had hoped would hold. And when that line broke, the Pentagon did not hesitate. They responded with urgency, precision, and a level of military coordination we have not seen since the earliest days of this war. This is not a theoretical escalation. This is not a diplomatic posture. This is a 4 to 8 hour countdown that began this morning. And the world is watching. For months now, there had been signals, not official Kremlin announcements, not formal diplomatic communications, just signals that Putin was preparing something unprecedented. Putin has been aggressive, yes, but he has been calculated in his aggression. His moves have followed a certain predictability, a rhythm, almost a doctrine. But what set off alarm bells in Washington and Brussels this week was that the rhythm went silent. Intelligence officials who monitor Russian military posturing know the indicators, the movement of strategic assets, the repositioning of command structures, the unusual patterns in an encrypted communications, the sudden withdrawal of diplomatic personnel, all of that went quiet. And whenever Putin goes quiet, it means something is about to get loud. Senior defense officials speaking with multiple outlets under condition of anonymity confirmed that over the past 72 hours, Russian military activity in occupied territories shifted in ways that defied their standard operational patterns. There were no press briefings. There were no theatrical announcements from Kremlin spokespeople. There was only silence. And in that silence, something was being prepared. Early this morning, United States intelligence services detected what they described as a coordinated strategic repositioning of Russian forces, including the mobilization of tactical missile units that had not been activated in over 18 months. These are the kinds of assets that Moscow only deploys when they are signaling something very specific, imminent offensive action, a major territorial push, or a direct challenge to Western resolve. Pentagon analysts didn't know which category this fell into, or whether it fell into all three at once. But what they did know was that Russia was changing its posture. And when a nuclear armed adversary shifts posture without explanation, even by a small margin, the Pentagon pays attention. Within hours of this detection, the White House was briefed. Within hours after that, emergency protocols were activated. This was not a drill. This was not a precaution. This was a response to something concrete, something immediate, something that demanded action. The warning issued by Vladimir Putin tonight was not normal. It was not routine. It was not symbolic. It was urgent. Source after source, briefing after briefing, described Putin's ultimatum as unprecedented in its directness, threatening in its specificity, and perhaps most importantly, actionable in its timeline. Putin demanded that President Volodymyr Zelensky comply with a set of conditions within 48 hours. The details of those conditions remain partially classified, but multiple sources have confirmed they include demands for territorial concessions, demilitarization of specific regions, and guarantees regarding Ukraine's future NATO membership. These are demands that Zelensky has rejected publicly, repeatedly, and unequivocally. And Putin knows this, which means this ultimatum was never really about negotiation. It was about justification. It was about creating a pretext. But intimidation only works if the target hesitates. Zelensky did not. The Pentagon did not. In fact, their response today was among the fastest and most comprehensive we've seen in this entire conflict. Here's what we know. Within 3 hours of Putin's ultimatum becoming known to defense officials, the Pentagon activated what sources describe as an emergency Ukraine defense plan. These weren't the standard military assistance packages. These weren't the routine arms shipments. These were pre-positioned rapid deployment protocols, systems and coordination mechanisms that the United States only activates when they are preparing to defend against an imminent large-scale offensive. Tonight, defense officials confirmed that the Pentagon launched emergency coordination operations with NATO allies, including the activation of rapid response units that had been placed on standby in Eastern European member states. Additionally, intelligence sharing protocols were elevated to their highest priority level, ensuring that Ukraine's military command would receive real-time battlefield intelligence directly from U.S. surveillance assets. The Pentagon acted before Russia could capitalize on the element of surprise. They reinforced early warning systems. They accelerated delivery of critical air defense components. They provided targeting data for Ukrainian long-range strike capabilities that were likely preparing to engage advancing Russian formations. In other words, the Pentagon targeted the strategic advantage that Putin was attempting to create, the window that would have made his ultimatum more than just words. This is what made Putin's warning so dangerous. His ultimatum wasn't just symbolic. It was actionable. It represented the kind of move that could fundamentally alter the battlefield if left unchecked. And the Pentagon, understanding that fully, responded with force. Not recklessly, not impulsively, but strategically. They didn't flood the zone with indiscriminate support. They didn't issue empty counter-threats. They hit the pressure points. They reinforced the vulnerabilities. They denied Russia the operational freedom it was seeking. Military analysts we spoke with tonight described this as a textbook example of deterrence through denial, making the cost of action so high and the probability of success so low that the aggressor is forced to recalculate. And here's where the story becomes even more significant. Intelligence officials now believe that Putin's ultimatum was designed to test the unity of Western support for Ukraine after months of political debate in Washington over continued military assistance. Putin wanted to see whether the United States would hesitate. He wanted to see whether European allies would fracture. He wanted to see whether Zelensky would show any sign of wavering. But instead, the opposite happened. The Pentagon didn't delay. NATO allies didn't fragment. Zelensky's response was so immediate, so defiant, that even the Kremlin noticed you don't get Putin's attention easily. But today, the West did. Defense analysts speaking with major news outlets under anonymity described Putin's gambit as a pressure test, a way to gauge whether cracks had formed in the coalition supporting Ukraine. But the Pentagon proved today that they remain both vigilant and unified. Their actions were not only swift, they were coordinated so precisely that allied forces across multiple nations were operating in synchronization within hours. That coordination matters because it shows that despite political debates, the military infrastructure of Western support for Ukraine remains intact. It shows that the Pentagon is not merely observing this conflict. They are actively shaping it. They are anticipating Russian moves and positioning responses before those moves can achieve their intended effect. This is the kind of strategic depth that Putin has consistently underestimated, and today he was reminded of it. As reports continued coming in throughout the evening, we learned more about the scale of the Pentagon's response. U.S. European Command carried out emergency consultations with all front-line NATO states, forcing accelerated coordination on air defense positioning. Well, American intelligence assets targeted Russian command and control nodes that had been activated in the last 48 hours. Special operations advisors operating in coordination with Ukrainian forces reportedly increased their support for strike planning used by Kyiv to disrupt Russian logistics. Naval assets in the Black Sea region were placed on heightened alert, monitoring any Russian movement that could indicate a broader offensive push. This wasn't just military assistance. This wasn't just alliance management. This was integrated deterrence. This was strategic messaging through action. And strategic coherence is the one thing Putin has struggled to disrupt since the war began. For every advance Russia has made, the West has countered with something that complicates their consolidation. For every territorial gain, there has been a cost. For every ultimatum, there has been a response. And tonight's response may be the most significant yet. Remember, Putin thought this war would last days, not years. He thought Kiev would fall in the opening weeks. He thought NATO would fracture under the pressure of energy costs and political division. He thought Zelensky would flee. But tonight, the exact opposite is happening. Kiev still stands. NATO is more unified than at any point in decades. Zelensky has become a symbol of resistance recognized around the world. And Russia's military has suffered losses that even their own internal assessments describe as strategically significant. Putin's 48-hour ultimatum is not a sign of strength. It is a sign of frustration. It is a sign that the war he thought would be quick has become a quagmire. And it is a sign that he is looking for any leverage he can find. What makes this moment so critical and so dangerous is that Putin's ultimatum happened at a time when he is under intense pressure from multiple directions. Hardliners in his own government want faster results. Military commanders want more resources. Economic advisors want stabilization. Nationalist voices want escalation. Putin is balancing these demands while managing a war that has already lasted far longer than he ever intended. And when leaders in that position make sudden moves, they're not doing it from strength. They're doing it from pressure. They're doing it from vulnerability. They're doing it because they need anything that looks like a win. And a 48-hour ultimatum, regardless of whether it achieves its stated goals, gives Putin something to point to. It gives him a moment of apparent dominance. It gives him footage and sound bites and the appearance of control. But appearances are not the same as reality. And the reality is that tonight his ultimatum was met not with capitulation, but with defiance. The Pentagon's emergency protocols, now confirmed through multiple official channels, were designed to signal that the United States is not willing to allow Russia to dictate terms through intimidation. Defense officials said plainly that Putin's ultimatum was inconsistent with any genuine interest in peaceful resolution. That is diplomatic language for, we know this is a pretext and we're not playing along. You don't usually hear that tone from the Pentagon unless something serious is at stake. And tonight, the stakes could not be higher, because this isn't just about Ukraine anymore. She is about the fundamental question of whether international boundaries can be redrawn through force. This is about whether ultimatums backed by military power can override the sovereignty of nations. And the answer, at least from Washington, was delivered clearly today. The answer was no. Meanwhile, President Volodymyr Zelensky addressed the Ukrainian people in a resolute, measured speech tonight. He said, "We have faced ultimatums before. We are still here." He said, "Ukraine will not negotiate with threats. We negotiate with partners, and we defend against aggressors." And he said, "Every hour of this countdown is an hour we use to strengthen, to prepare, and to stand united." These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are statements from a leader who understands just how high the stakes have become. Zelensky has been through this before. He has seen deadlines come and go. He has seen threats materialize and threats evaporate. And through it all, he has maintained a consistency of message that has kept both his people and his allies focused on the same objective. Tonight was no different. Here's what makes the situation even more concerning. Putin's ultimatum wasn't isolated. Along with the 48-hour deadline, Russian state media launched a coordinated messaging campaign emphasizing military readiness and the seriousness of Putin's demands. Belarusian forces increased activity along their border with Ukraine, raising concerns about a potential secondary front. Russian cyber operations increased their targeting of Ukrainian infrastructure, including energy grids and communication networks. All of this happened within the same 24-hour period. When Putin moves multiple pieces at once, it means something larger is underway. It means the ultimatum is not just words, it is part of a broader strategy. And that strategy appears to involve creating pressure from every possible angle. Intelligence analysts are now considering several possibilities. One is that Putin is preparing for a renewed offensive using the ultimatum as cover for military repositioning. Another is that Putin is attempting to fracture Western unity by forcing immediate decisions under artificial time pressure. A third possibility, the one worrying officials the most, is that Putin is attempting to create conditions that would justify an escalation, including the potential use of weapons or tactics previously held in reserve. But today, the Pentagon took that card off the table. They didn't wait for the deadline. They didn't engage in extended deliberation. They didn't signal hesitation. They acted. And in acting, they sent a message that Russia will not be allowed to dictate the terms of this conflict through ultimatums. What we're watching now is a test of resolve. Putin wants to see whether pressure will break Western commitment. Zelensky wants to show that Ukraine will not be intimidated. NATO wants to prevent any perception of weakness. And the Pentagon wants to prevent any miscalculation that could lead to broader escalation. Every move in the next 48 hours will be watched. Every statement will be analyzed. Every military positioning will be tracked, because this is not just a moment. This is a threshold. And what happens at this threshold will shape everything that follows. Tonight, we've heard from senior defense officials who are now monitoring Russian movements in real time. They say there has been no indication of immediate offensive action yet. They say Russian forces remain in elevated readiness, but have not crossed into new positions. And they say Putin's decision to issue a public ultimatum is likely part of a psychological pressure campaign intended to test reactions rather than initiate immediate combat. But the Pentagon is not assuming benign intent. In fact, the Pentagon is preparing for every contingency. Their response today, fast, unified, and unmistakable, sent a message to Moscow that attempts at intimidation will be met with strength. And it sent a message to Kyiv that the United States remains committed to Ukraine's defense. As the countdown continues, we expect more details to emerge about what exactly Putin hoped to achieve with this ultimatum. But what we do know is that the Pentagon's response was timely. It reinforced deterrence at a critical moment. It demonstrated alliance cohesion under pressure. And it denied Russia the initiative it was seeking. What happens next will depend on what Putin does in the next 48 hours. If he steps back, this moment will be remembered as another failed attempt at coercion. If he escalates, the Pentagon and NATO have already shown they are ready. They have shown they are prepared. They have shown they are unified. And they have shown they will respond. And tonight, for the first time in weeks, the Kremlin appears to be recalculating. Moscow is quiet, too quiet. And when Putin is quiet after issuing an ultimatum, it means he is thinking. It means he is assessing whether his gambit achieved its purpose. It means he is choosing his next move carefully, because tonight, Vladimir Putin learned something he has learned many times before. Ultimatums do not work against nations that refuse to be intimidated. Threats do not fracture alliances that remain unified. And deadlines set by aggressors do not bind defenders. This story is far from over. But tonight, one thing is clear: Ukraine is not backing down. The West is not fragmenting. And the 48-hour clock that Putin thought would pressure his adversaries has instead united them. And we will be here, watching every detail as the next phase unfolds.